I'm here today to talk to all of you about data storytelling and a couple of core principles that we hope that you can take away with you and implement in your day-to-day in whatever capacity of data storytelling you have. My name is Soleil Kelly, and I am a product marketer at Google Cloud, and I specifically focus on our BI solution, and that includes both products and a kind of solution set, as well as data visualization and data storytelling type scenarios. I'll be joined a little bit later by Ilya Blinderman. Ilya is a journalist and an engineer. I would probably call him a data viz developer ninja as well. He does some really, really cool stuff with his outfit called The Pudding. They're based in New York and cover, from a data journalism perspective, everything from sports to popular culture to just interesting things that are going on in the world, and do some really, really amazing work. And I'm excited for you guys to be able to hear from him on some of the things that that they put out in the world and how they think about data journalism. That was that slide. I should have done that before. Can we cut over to the demo, please? What I first wanted to share is our typical data storytelling experience and how we consume data stories. And you're seeing a lot of lorem ipsum here, and that's by design. How many of you receive these really long emails that have a couple of facts sprinkled in? There's maybe a call to action buried in there somewhere. You don't know where your name might be. There's some tables. Nothing's clickable. And in the end, you're like, OK, archive. I'm done. Raise your hand. OK, yeah. So this is pretty typical data. That is a data story that somebody was trying to tell, and you've been the recipient of those, as have I. Can we go back to the slides, please? Those are not very consumable, and we're here again to talk through a couple of core things that hopefully you can employ and spread around to those around you to tell better data stories. And that is our whole agenda today, is just to cover these 4 really simple principles. And we're going to go through them a couple of times. Hopefully you'll walk away remembering them. So the first one is simply tell a story. And what that means is a couple of things. Fundamentally, as humans, we're so conditioned. We grew up as children hearing and reading stories, and it's a familiar format. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a resolution typically. Stories are very powerful, and they've been told since 30,000 BC, right? There are also a couple different types of stories with respect to data storytelling. There are explanatory data stories and exploratory data stories. As the name suggests, exploratory are, think, a dashboard with annotation. They're designed for you to be able to click into, to ask your own questions, to explore a data set, to come up with your own insights, etc. Explanatories follow much more of a traditional linear path. The author of that data story are guiding you along. In the end of either of these, you have a call to action. You should be doing something or thinking about something. Exploratory, it's finding those insights, or maybe it's just confirming something you knew about the performance of your business or what have you. And in the explanatory, it could be do this or do that, right? So those are storytelling just at a high level. Ilya is going to cover some more of this stuff too, so we'll keep on moving. Second of all, have the data itself dictate what kind of data visualization you're choosing. It's really common to see some really compelling data visualization you've seen online, probably on Ilya's website or some others, and you say, wow, I want that in my data story. I want to put that in my presentation. And you try and fit the data to that data visualization. It's exactly the opposite approach you should be taking, right? You should really think about, what am I trying to convey with this data? Am I expressing a relationship, proportions, et cetera, like comparing 2 different things? And those types of expressions, what you're trying to convey with the data, is what should dictate what type of data visualization. Also, don't be afraid of bar charts and pie charts. They are very common for a very good reason, because they work. And we are used to them as humans. We can consume that information very easily. And so don't be afraid of those, because they're very effective. The other thing to note, too, is that as I was alluding to earlier, with different types of data visualizations, if you try and fit your data to it, you can use data visualizations. Well, they're very powerful, and you can use them to mislead people. Sometimes people do that by design. Proportions of area, if you're not taking into consideration like the population in that area, things you can mislead people. You oftentimes see political maps of the United States with like all the big red counties, or counties voting red versus voting blue. The small counties in the cities vote blue. Looks like a smaller proportion of the vote, right? But if you do it properly, then you would actually see a much more balanced vote across red versus blue, for instance. Third principle is around interactivity. We live in, it's 2018, we all have a smartphone in our pocket. We are used to touching things, exploring things. This is the paradigm we live in. And by gosh, please include interactivity in your data stories, because people like to click, they like to use that tooltip and see what's going on, right? It is a means by which you can engage your audience as you are guiding people down a narrative path. Interactivity can allow people to take a little sidetrack and say, oh, well, I see we're talking about X, Y, or Z subject at this point in the story, but I see myself in a different context, so let me just use that filter and see what it means for me. Right? The narrative might have a default, say, state view of whatever metric, but you can pick your own state through a filter and see, oh, what does that mean for me, as an example. And this, again, lets people stay much more engaged in the story. The fourth principle is mind the design. So we're not all designers. Who would consider themselves like a designer by trade or by profession? Anybody? Okay, cool. And then who feels like they're like, okay, I'm okay at design. I kind of understand it. Who's like, I got no design skills at all? Okay, use templates. If you don't have any design skills, use templates. They help. Besides using templates, if you don't have any design skills, there's some basic things to think about, which is just keep in mind fonts, the sizes of things, color choice. Just make sure they're consistent. And just don't be all over the place. Just spend a couple of minutes, because if you think about design and you design with a little bit more purpose, you'll actually make your story much easier to consume. And if your point is for people to consume your story, then by gosh, you should leverage design to help you do that. One of the other things with that is to use negative space or white space, whatever your background color is, it doesn't have to be white, to focus people's attention. So start from a blank space and include things in your designs, in your story, where it's relevant along that narrative path that gives people a point of focus, right? And the size of, say, some data viz in your story might be much bigger than some other one, because you want to attract a lot of attention. You want to catch people's eye to that space or to that point in the narrative arc. Now, can we cut over to the demo machine? I want to now kind of undo that original email that you saw was an email that Maya is her name in this particular scenario, had sent out to her colleagues at her company, Foo Hardware, to compel them to come to their quarterly all hands. She's been doing some really great things with her team. She wanted to share those insights, and she really she wanted people to go. She wanted to share those with other teams so that collectively as an organization, they could all do much greater things. So if we had applied those 4 principles in Maya's data story, this is maybe what that might have looked like. And I'm not Ilya as a data journalist and as a designer and things like that too, so bear with me. So here again, we have a title. We kind of, if we start consuming this data story, we kind of know where we're at. There's a bit of a question mark here too. Can we reach much greater in revenue? Laying out some visuals just to intrigue people. Oh, interesting. Okay, keep scrolling down. What's here? Right. So we have a bit more of a dashboard feel, where people can select the date if they wanted to filter by date. Oh, I don't work in the same department as Maya. Maybe I could see myself in this dashboard here for my department. You could select those there. And here we're just laying out some just basic, I mean, this is the information that Maya knows her stakeholders want to see, so she's including it in the pre-read for this quarterly all hands. And she's listing out some different departmental revenues, different contributions by different departments cumulatively over time. Now, people, the consumers of the story are thinking, okay, this is great. Well, now let's look at revenue by state. Oops. So she includes very similar. So she's guiding people along a path here to think about revenue broken down by some of their top states. And you notice too, May and October have a pretty significant bump in revenue across those different states. And she acknowledges this for the audience to say, hey, May and October, lots of things going on there. Like, hey, we want to kind of zoom into that. And then here she lays out, our team piloted a marketing initiative during this time in the paint department in California, basically. So let's take a look at the results. So she opens that up to show different revenue by, or for the different states, but for the paint department specifically, right? And so you can see in Q1, she had a lot of impact from that campaign that she was running. People naturally want to question, can we do this again? Was it just a fluke that this worked on the first time around? So she says, hey, we did this with appliances as well, and that also worked. I know you have questions as the audiences, or as the consumer of this. Bring them to the quarterly all hands. We want to share with you how we arrived at these insights. So kind of breaking that down, you see there's a path to the narrative. Now, it's not an amazing narrative. It's just a demo. There's design taken into account. We use a lot of white space. There's some alignment, and we're pretty consistent with the fonts and things like that. The data visualizations themselves are not like crazy wild things that you might experience out in the web in various places, but they're effective. They do the job to convey the information that Maya wanted to convey. And there's that light bit of interactivity for people to be able to click into. So this is, can we cut over to the slides real quick? So those are the 4 principles. Again, tell a story, let the data dictate the visualization, include an activity, and also mind the design. I'd like to welcome now Ilya up on stage from the pudding.
Thanks, y'all. My name is Ilya Blinderman. I'm a journalist engineer over at The Pudding. We are a data-driven, visual storytelling focused publication. We started up a couple of years ago. We're based out in New York. We have a few folks in Seattle and also in Great Barrington in Massachusetts, the hub of data-driven storytelling. We have been up and running for a couple of years now, and we get about 5 million views a year. People seem to be excited about the sort of work that we do, which is very exciting and humbling for us. You may have seen a few of our stories out in the wild. So we've covered the lyrical dexterity, the lyrical richness of various rappers. We've tried to analyze whether or not pop music has been getting more and more repetitive over time. Spoiler, it has been. We've looked at the gender imbalance in film screenplays. So we've kind of done a lot of work that spans the gamut of topics. And today I wanted to present a couple of stories to you, take you through them, give you a sense of how we build a narrative out, and also give you a sense of how we apply those 4 principles that Soleil mentioned in our day-to-day work. So if we can switch over to the demo, please. All right. There have been a lot of conversations about this potential looming crisis of job automation. And this is something that we've looked at previously, but this particular story is something that's going to be dropping next week. You're getting a little bit of a sneak preview. And it was pitched to us by a freelancer, a biostats PhD student named Jordan Dworkin. And The idea was to figure out how we can best help the people that are at risk of being made redundant as a result of automation. So if your job is at risk, what should you do? And a lot of the conversations that we've seen recently about this have dealt with truckers, with the trucking industry. So we decided to focus on that. Now, there's not much. Just give me 1 second here. There we go. So a few years ago, a study came out and ranked all of these jobs in the US by the likelihood that they're going to be automated. So jobs like elementary school teachers are pretty safe. There's a 0% likelihood because they involve a lot of different tasks. They involve large social components. But jobs like telemarketers, on the other hand, with a lot of routine labor, that don't really have a tremendous amount of social skill involved with them a lot of the time, because people use scripts, are at risk. Now, truckers are a job that's very much at risk of being automated. So there's a 79% likelihood that will be able to replace a large number of these employees. And it's a problem because there's millions of truckers in the US. So what happens to these millions of people if the numbers of that particular job are decimated? Well, one of the things that we've heard recently as a potential alternative or as a potential conduit to actually get them to a good place is to retrain them, to make them developers. It's Developer Day, I'm sure there are a few in the room. We seem to think, at least I count myself as one, we seem to think that it's a pretty safe gig. It has pretty good outcomes for the future. There's a 40% likelihood that developers are going to be automated. So seemingly a bright future, but there's a little bit of an issue with taking that tack and kind of saying, well, look, we're going to take everybody and then we're just going to make them developers, right? It's a nice idea in theory, but it's a little more difficult in practice because the skills that you have as a trucker don't translate all that well to skills that developers possess. As you can see here, developers program. That's pretty obvious. But in these conversations, we gloss over the fact that it can be difficult to retrain a large population of folks who lack the necessary skills. Now, if you look here, there is a series of skills listed up on screen. That's the Department of Labor that classifies every single job in the US and quantifies the skills that are important to it in order to perform the job appropriately, to perform it well. So as you can see here, programming is important for developers, whereas mechanical work, operations monitoring, repair, that's more important for truckers. So what we can do is take a look at the difference, at how far apart these two jobs are on these dimensions, and get a sense of how difficult it is to retrain them. So if you have no programming experience, it's probably going to be pretty difficult to get you up to speed and to allow you to embrace a new career. Now, what if we take all of these differences and stack them up? We can actually do that. And we can create these metrics, right, which give you a sense of how different each job is to the job of a trucker. So, for example, developers, yeah, they're pretty different. CEOs, super different. Obviously, there's very little overlap compared to for a CEO in terms of the daily tasks involved in the job. Ambulance drivers, they seem to have a pretty high overlap in terms of the amount of, in terms of the skill importance of both of those jobs. So, all right, now that we've kind of unpacked this idea of skill similarity, let's jump back into this idea of how do we transition people from a job that's likely to be automated to something else. We can consider how similar a job is to truckers. So septic tank servicers are a job that's very similar. Psychologists is a job that is highly dissimilar. But there are many things we need to consider, right? You can't just think, oh, a job is similar. Let's grab all these millions of people and then move them into that sector. We've discussed the idea of automatability, so why don't we build that into this model right here? Okay, cool. So now we've got two things. We got two axes. Automatability likelihood. So jobs that are up top are less likely to be automated. Jobs that are down the bottom are highly likely to be automated. We're probably interested in this quadrant over here. So we've got power line installers, we've got ship engineers, seem to have pretty similar skills, low automatability. We have captains, mates, and pilots of water vessels. So there's a few things here that seem to be viable alternatives. But again, there are two factors we're considering. That's really not that much. First, let's get rid of all the jobs that are more likely to be automated than truckers. So we'll change that axis a little bit. And let's add another factor in, so salary, right? You don't want to transition people from a job that allows them to have a solid middle-class income without a college education into another job that requires the same education level but is a drastic reduction in terms of what they're going to be making that year. So again, power line installers seem to be a pretty good option here. The ship's captains, ship engineers, we have a few forensic science technicians. But again, we need to build this picture out a little more. And if we decide to include the number of jobs that are likely to be available in 10 years' time, we have a much more complex picture that emerges. So if you look up at the top of that tooltip, you'll see there's 117,000 power line installers and repairers that are going to be around, projected in 10 years' time. And you can tell that if you've got over 1 million truckers around, you're going to have to do more than just funnel people into power line installer education programs, because there's more than 10 times the amount of truckers that exist today. Same with all these other jobs. And if you want to find a career that's less similar, but that has a high number of employees projected in 10 years' time, well, you might have to start thinking about the retraining programs that you implement. So what I'd like to now do is, is run through this story and flag a few of the ideas that Soleil had mentioned early on, right? So the four principles. First off, the idea of storytelling. Initially, when we started having a conversation with Jordan about working on this piece, he had already developed a tool which allows you to take any job and factors in the skills involved, factors in the salary of that job, the number of people employed in it, so all the things that we kind of built out at the end, and gives you a sense of the jobs that you can transition to. Now, tools are hard, right? You can't just give someone a tool because you need to explain to them how you should be using it. You have to explain why it's important. And so we thought, you know what? Let's start at a concrete example. And so that's why we decided to go and say, let's talk about truckers, because that's a conversation that's been in the news recently. So we anchored the piece in a concrete example, and we built things out from that. Design. We tried to keep things super sparse and super simple. There are a lot of complicated ideas that we're throwing around and we're giving to lay readers, people that don't necessarily have the technical background here. And what we wanted to do was get rid of as much clutter as possible. So we have a simple axis, we have some really simple icons, we have some simple labels. We tried to use consistent colors, so blue we ended up using for jobs that would be fairly safe, and red for jobs that were somewhat more in danger. We also used some highlights in the text just to make sure that there's that implicit association between the color blue and jobs that are considered much less at risk. Let's talk about the idea of the visuals driving the data driving the visuals. Now, as I said, the things that we discuss here are a little more complex, right? We're building this crazy model out, and we're taking people through all these series of steps, right? It can be a little daunting for a reader to come across something like this and have enough patience to delve into it and read sufficiently to make sense of everything that's happening. So what we decided to do was use object constancy. So have the same circles, visualize the whole way through, and then keep stacking things up and have a consistent visual approach throughout this piece. We also relied, or rather Jordan, who did the data analysis here, relied on a concept called Euclidean distance. So he took the differences here between the skills for each of the jobs, and then he built them into these metrics. If you say Euclidean distance to someone that has no background in math, like that sucks. No one wants to hear about that. It sounds complicated. It's intimidating. But if you show them this visual, they're like, oh yeah, it's just the differences, then you stack them up, and then you do the oh yeah, I get it. I can see that CEOs are super different. Intuitively, it makes sense. So what we wanted to do was build this complex story step by step by step so that people would be able to grasp the final point, which is a little bit more like cognitively intensive if you present it straight away. When it comes to interactivity, I think you saw there's very little involved in this story. There's actually going to be a little more in the final version, but really, we wanted people on a set of rails for this narrative, right? We don't want people to be able to explore too much because the idea itself is complicated enough without having those degrees of freedom to distract people. So what we wanted to do was just let people explore a little bit, see which jobs we're discussing, and leave it at that. So that's the first story. Second story is by a colleague of mine, Russell Goldenberg. He is the Great Barrington, Massachusetts representative of the pudding. So, could San Ramon, California really be the microbrew capital of the US? Do we have any microbrew fans here? I would assume so. Yeah, okay, cool, right. I don't know if you've had these conversations with your friends, but the idea of a city being the capital of X, in this case microbreweries, is pretty common, right? Like, New York is the capital of pizza. You know, San Francisco is like the capital of tacos. I don't know, but these discussions get thrown around a lot. And what Russell wanted to do was actually explore that. So, let's see. Not quite. San Ramon isn't doing super well, but you know, it's not the worst. Santa Rosa is actually the spot that he calculated to be the most impressive microbrewery city. But how do you go about calculating that? Like, how do you say that a city is best on like this dimension? So you can go and poll a whole bunch of people and say like, what do you think of microbreweries in San Francisco? And then out of 100 people, you know, 20 say it's 5 out of 5, it's great. And then in New York, 10 people say 5 out of 5. So you can say, oh, okay, well, it looks like San Francisco beats out New York. Or you can look to data. You can say, or publicly available data, rather, I should say. You can look at the quantity of microbreweries. If a city has just like tons and tons and tons, dozens of microbreweries in every neighborhood, maybe that's a good destination. But what if all those microbreweries suck? What are you going to do? I mean, no one wants to go to a location with tons of destinations, but all of those destinations actually suck. So you should probably incorporate quality into that. And that's what Russell did. So he created a metric which combines both of those things. Whoops. So Santa Rosa's number 1, Salt Lake City's number 2. San Diego's number 2, Denver's number 3. But there's still a little bit of a black box here, right? Like, we're still trusting someone else to do the calculations for us, And we're trusting them to come to the conclusions for us, which is fine enough. But if you have this like weird, lingering uncertainty about this, if you're not quite comfortable with that, that's good, right? Because anyone can go and say, oh yeah, sure, San Diego's really good. I just calculated it. Don't worry about how I did it. So what Russell did to account for that is allow the reader here to figure this out for themselves. If you want to say, okay, look, I just want to go to a place that has 1 billion microbreweries, you can go and do that with this slider. Denver's great, so is Portland. But if you want to say, no, I just want the best microbreweries, period, you can change this up. Santa Rosa is number 1, Anchorage is number 2, San Diego is number 3. We can also then go and say, well, how's the microbrew trend? Is it kind of on the ebb? Is it increasing? As of the time of writing this, we were still moving on up. Microbreweries were still opening. But the trend is a little more interesting when you break it down on a by state level. So if you look at the number of microbreweries opening per 100,000 people, Vermont is actually number 1. So it saw some peaks and troughs, but for the past few years, it's been going very strong. Whereas Kentucky, for example, not doing so hot in terms of microbrew culture. Let's unpack this story a little more. And let's talk about it within the context of those 4 principles. So the first thing you should know is that the storytelling aspect kind of kicks off as soon as you load the page. San Ramon, California is where we've just been geolocated. So if you're looking at this in Anchorage, Alaska, you would see the screen read, could Anchorage, Alaska really be the microbrew capital of the, of the US? So straight off the bat, what we try to do is get the reader engaged personally as soon as they open the page. And we then add this transition from the personal to the more broad, where we say, well, not quite, but let's discuss the best microbreweries. When it comes to design, you can see colors are really simple. It's a little bit of like a beer palette here, like light browns, dark browns, but there are some accents too. So the idea was to focus on cities, and so what Russell did was have these kind of ready orange circles pop up. Interactivity and visual choice here are pretty closely related. There's not a lot of interactivity in the piece. There's no tooltips. The 2 final charts you saw were static. But over here, there actually is a little bit. And the 2 are tied intrinsically because this chart didn't, as far as I know, exist previously. So Russell calls this a weighted pivot scatter plot, which is a little bit of a mouthful. But the idea is that you have 2 factors, right? Quantity and quality. And then you take those and you fold them up, you combine them to create a single metric. And when I say that, like, I'm not even comfortable explaining it verbally. Like, I know it's like the whole Euclidean distance thing. It sucks. But if I show this to you visually, you're like, oh yeah, I kind of get it. This is quality. Yeah, that's where I'm headed. Could we switch back to the slides, please? I just want to reprise a few of these principles that Soleil mentioned, because I think as far as takeaways from the talk, what we would like to leave you with is kind of 4 core points that you could lean on. As you've seen in the 2 stories that I presented, narrative plays a large part in telling a compelling data-driven story. It's much easier to start with a specific case study and then build to a greater trend, to build out into something a little more general once you've piqued people's interest. Now, That works particularly well for an explanatory story. But again, as Soleil said, there are also exploratory stories. You've got stories where the users are already equipped with the knowledge to interact, to dig, to gain insights, where you don't have to hold their hands. And in that case, they don't really need the narrative because they want you to get out of the way. All they need is to have the tools and to be able to explore. So clear design, clear UX, that's what they're after. The second principle, have the data dictate the visuals. So I've kind of harped on about this in terms of the stories that I showed you, but we agonize over this, over the pudding. We constantly think, is this the simplest, clearest, most concise way of making these points, right? Most of the time, you probably don't need to build out a weighted pivot scatter plot. There's a reason why Russell had built it for that story and hadn't even thought about it previously. And there's probably a reason why most people haven't tried to incorporate them in any of the data stories that they've been putting out. Bar charts go a long way. They're simple. You see one, you know how it works. It has a simple name. Same with pie charts. There's a reason for that, right? Trying to figure out which of the simplest visualizations available best serves your need is something that I would advise you to keep in mind while you're working on something like this constantly. Interactivity. You don't always have to build interactivity in, but it does give a really nice layer for the audience to drill into, to double-click into, to get a little bit more insight. This is for the user that likes what you're doing, sees it, and wants to gain a little bit more out of what you're providing, out of the narrative. Finally, be mindful and considerate when you're designing these things. I've, again, tried to emphasize the use of very simple fonts, simple color palettes. And the reason is that it can be very tempting to try to kind of fulfill all of your artistic, creative desires with this stuff. But really, at the end of the day, our goal when we're telling any sort of data-driven story, whether it's something as long as what we do over the pudding, or whether you've just built a deck and are trying to present quarterly results, the point is communication. And you don't want to hamstring yourself by being overly creative and detracting from the clarity of what you're about to say. A couple of things. So in case anyone interested in the tools that we use over the pudding, we are kind of tool agnostic. A lot of our visualizations are either static, and we can put them together in something as simple as Google Slides or Keynote. And then the interactive stuff usually comes through with JavaScript, specifically the D3 library. Our analyses range in tools employed from like anything, again, as core and go-to as like Google Sheets, to SQL, to Pandas, and R. I actually want to bring it back to Soleil real quick, because now that we've kind of discussed these tools, we've discussed these 4 principles, I want to make sure that you have a sense, or have at least a series of guidelines when it comes to applying them in some of the contexts that you all might be employing data visualization in.
Sweet, thank you. Thank you, Ilya. See, super cool stories, right? Ilya and I debated this slide for quite some time. Yesterday, by the way. The first line in here, just taking a step back, what this represents is really, if there are lots of different types of data stories, we just talked about these 4 principles, how can we kind of overlay them for these different use cases, right? How should I weight those different principles? Because you're not going to use all of them in all of your data stories. It doesn't actually make sense. So this is meant to represent some guidelines. This is not a hard and fast rule, obviously, for what's on the slide. But that first line, the first row for data journalism, it's like 25% all the way across. I don't know. It really depends on the story. But generally speaking, you have to consider all 4 of those things when you're a data journalist, right? Dashboarding for the second row there, like you have to have the right data in there, and you need to represent it very, very accurately, right? That is paramount to all. The other pieces are much less. For tell a story, for narrative, for exec dashboarding, think of that as annotation, right? You're going to provide some cues, some focus for people of where to pay attention to, but it's really much more through annotation, maybe some titles, things like that, and captions. Infographics are much more on the visual and design side, as opposed to some of the other elements. And we've all been through lots of potentially QBRs or MBRs, monthly business reports, things like that, where again it's kind of like with exec dashboarding, you really need to have a very true to your health of your business picture of your data, and so the visual choice is really key there. On the bottom, we're giving a one-to-many presentation now. Did we have interactivity for you to engage with? No, we engaged with it as the presenters. But if you're giving presentations, it is you and your perspective that is providing that interactivity, and not necessarily something that your audience will be able to interact with. They'll be engaged, ideally, by the way you're interacting with it and sharing that, but nonetheless. And then annual reports, you get the picture, I think. Finally, our call to action, because our story is now done, is to take inspiration from places around you. I'm not going to read off all the names here of some places to go read some really amazing stuff and some people to go follow. I will call out a couple. Hans Rosling has a very famous TED Talk. Go watch it. It's very, very inspiring. And he like lives and breathes the data, and you're on the edge of your seat watching what he's doing. It's really fun. There's a famous quote. I forget the name of the author. I should have looked that up. But he wrote a blog a while back, and it's called "How to Steal Like an Artist." Does anybody know the name? Cleon. Yeah. Thank you, Austin Cleon. Thank you. So we as humans take in inspiration all the time. And the premise of his article and some of his work is like, look, you take in inspiration from your influences, and it comes through you in your creative output, right? When you are creating a data story, whether it's for work or for personal, whatever, you are creating something, and you're going to be taking influence from things that you've seen. So take inspiration from these people, from these sources, and take a cue, especially if you're not a designer and trying to create some weighted pivot scatter. What was it called? I'm just kidding. Anyway, take inspiration from there and from these sources, and that'll help a lot. Use templates as well. That can get you started, and then pivot from there. That concludes our talk today. So thank you all so much. We have a couple of microphones here. If you want to stand up and ask us any questions, we'd love to take them. We'd also love your feedback if you open up the app and can fill that out. We'd love to hear that. Ilya and I will stay up here on stage for any questions you might have. Thank you so much.